Welcome back to Right on Four Corners. I'm your host, DelSheree Gladden. I'm a USA Today bestselling author of over 30 published novels, and I'm a ninth grade English teacher. And on this week's episode, I am excited to have a Santa Fe author, Carol Moldaw, talking about her newest poetry collection, Go Figure. Carol, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, DelSheree. I'm Carol Moldaw, and Go Figure is my seventh book of poems. I live in Santa Fe I've been in New Mexico since 1990, and for the first 25 years almost, I lived in the Milwaukee Valley. Did I already say I'm from Northern California and have lived in the East Coast? And I feel like everything interesting that I have to say is in the poems. So a short introduction.
That is perfectly fine. We will jump in and get to hear some of the poems and talk about them. Tell us first a little bit about the collection, Go Figure, kind of where the concept came from and some of the topic and themes that you get into with the poetry in this collection.
Sure. Well, first we'll talk about the title, Go Figure. It's the title of one of the poems, but what I really liked many things about it when it came to me. One is that it's kind of a vernacular, an expression, go figure, like a kind of quizzicalness. And I like poems that allow the reader to draw their own conclusions. So I like that title, Go Figure. And then also there are a number of poems in the collection that reference art and artists, and visual art in particular, and figurative art. So the title also resonates on that level. I don't tend to have a concept when I start a book or even when I start a poem. I let it lead me, so there's a process of discovery and surprise for me when I'm writing. But, what I discovered as the poems started accumulating, but there are a lot of poems that really are about growing up with the expectations that I was brought up with as a girl and as a woman, and my examining and sometimes pushing against some of those expectations. And I'll just add one more thing, that during the writing of it, my mother, who is alive, she has Alzheimer's, which is a progressive disease. And so there are a number of poems about her and my reflecting back on her and our relationship and also the progression of that really awful disease.
Well, and I find that very interesting. I don't have a background in poetry, so getting to do this show has really introduced me to a wider range and let me talk to more poets, which has been wonderful. And it's been interesting to see, as I've been doing this, how poets approach putting together a collection. Sometimes it's sifting through poems created over a large period of time, or sometimes going into it with, I'm focusing on this idea, and then either stuff that's already been written or creating new poems to put together based on that theme. And I'm intrigued that you don't go into it with a concept, because even though you do cover a variety of ideas and topics and themes in this, they really come together and relate back to each other so well. That's interesting, and maybe kind of just speaking to, like you said, where you were at that point in your life and kind of where your thoughts are going and settling on in this time period of what you're experiencing and dealing with.
Well, I appreciate that it coheres. The poems were written over approximately a 7-year period. And I think what happens, as you must know, all writers tend to have their obsessions, and obsessions, come and go and resurface. And I think as the poems started to accumulate, I started to see that there were certain themes, and maybe I pushed on those a little bit. But I really wanted the manuscript to have, it's all in one section. It's not divided. A lot of poetry collections are divided into sections, and you can see, here are the poems about the mother, or here are the poems about when the poet was in some other part of the world. And I wanted this to have a flow and a kind of an ebb and a flow, similar to how I feel we are in our life and the mixture of our conscious and our unconscious, and things come and go and reappear.
Well, and it kind of struck me that, like you said, it's not chronological, it's not in a specific pattern. What kind of struck me was that it feels like when you're going about your day, just going through life, you remember certain things or you're experiencing something. So your thoughts kind of go where those take you. And it felt like that going through and reading the collection. Some are in the past, the present. Some you introduce, like Stuttgart, I may be saying that wrong. And then you circle back to it a little bit later where you have those moments when you're just going throughout your day-to-day life where it's like, oh yeah, remember that one time that happened, and then it pops back up. But in between that, you've got your day-to-day experiences and the pieces of life that just come and go. So it felt like a very natural flow throughout the collection.
So glad that is what I wanted. And it's interesting that Stuttgart poem, which I hadn't thought of reading, but maybe I will. The first one is a story I used to tell a lot about my mother being trapped in and I never was able to write it. And then, writing one and then thinking, just sort of writing the story and then thinking about it in the context of my mother's illness, provoked a whole second poem. And it is the way the daily life provokes thoughts and memories, but writing itself and crafting something also allows things to come up from the unconscious or that one just hadn't expected.
Absolutely. I think especially when you're in a writing practice where your mind is trained basically to go into that kind of creative mode to bring up something that may be worth writing about or a bit of inspiration that will lead you somewhere else. And that's something I've been trying to cultivate a little bit more because I've gotten out of the practice of writing over the last few years. And it's been a focus for my summer of trying to build that daily practice better.
It is hard, but it's a wonderful discipline, as you know. It's just so different from everything else. And I find I'm a kind of a slow writer, and I find I have to allow so much time for silence, for just, being at ease with things I'm not pleased with and being patient until something catches. And then when something catches, then I feel like I'm like a dog with a bone. I'm very persistent. And one thing I learned a long time ago is that craft in poetry, craft can refer to meter or rhyme or tonal things. But sometimes concentrating on craft is what allows things to come out. Sometimes concentrating on thought is more repressive or becomes too self-conscious for me, which is why I don't choose a theme ahead of time. I find that just represses anything interesting that actually might come up. For me, everybody's different.
Oh, it is interesting. I've always been more of a pantser type writer. I don't usually sit down and outline or do a detailed plot from start to finish. But as I've been trying to get back into writing and creating a better practice for myself, I had kind of started out that way this summer I'd had an idea that had been kind of hanging around in the back of my mind for a while. And it was like, okay, I'm just going to start with that. I'm just going to go and see where it takes me. And I'd gotten through about 12 chapters and I had to stop.
You're back in your practice.
It's slowly getting there. It was interesting because as I go through and write, I share what I'm doing and kind of discuss it with my boyfriend, Chris. And he's really good at finding those areas of, have you thought this part through all the way? Or take that a step further and see where that's going to take you and how it's going to impact the story. And I got to about that 12 chapter mark. And I was just like, there are so many things that I wasn't thinking about when I started this that now, I was keeping a list on one of the little digital sticky note things on my computer of, okay, I need to add this, I need to fix this, I need to go back to this section. And the list was getting so long. And I was like, okay, I got to stop writing new stuff. I need to go back and take care of all this other, because my mind was getting so cluttered up with everything that I needed to fix because I wasn't thinking about any of those basic craft elements that you need that really inform what you're doing as a writer. And so it's been a really interesting practice to go back now and go through that list and be like, okay, yeah, I just wasn't considering all of these really basic elements of writing. I was just bleh, get it all down on the page and let's see what comes out. And I'm kind of looking back and then it's okay, I need to do a little bit better about balancing that approach of, I'm still probably never going to be a detailed hardcore outliner, but taking that time, like you said, sitting with it, letting myself think through and feel where something's going and what the issues are and not just barreling through.
Well, it's interesting. I think, first of all, I would be daunted to write a novel. I wrote a short novel many years ago called The Widening, but it's more of a poetic novel. But I think, when I talk about craft, I'm not so much, I think as a novelist, you are thinking craft, part of that is balancing the plot or, how characters interact. And I mean almost more just for me, craft has a lot to do with the music of a poem. And so if I concentrate on that, on how it's resounding with what I think of as my inner tuning fork, then sometimes I don't even think about what I'm writing, and that allows for more to come out. I mean, I would never, I'm not an outliner. As I say, I don't plot my poems. I like to see how they evolve. And I like them to surprise me. I teach privately, and I always tell my students, if you're bored when you're reading through something or you're confused, the reader's only going to be more bored, more confused. Mm-hmm. So we have to do our inner voices, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I want to give you a chance to share some of the poems with us. Let me find the right page. Yeah, because I will keep talking forever, and I don't want to use up all the time.
You mentioned lessons, and it kind of, I think it gives a good synopsis of the expectations of, how I was brought up as a girl, as a kind of supportive, a woman as a supportive creature, as opposed to being the center of her own universe. So should I start with lessons?
That would be great, yeah.
Lessons. Taught as a girl to inquire after a man's day, to affirm with nod or smile what he says went right, to flutter the stray hand off shoulder or thigh, and emit a full-scale range of fluted laughter, to feign disbelief, inspire confidence. Taught not how to embellish, but to be my self-embellishment. In attentiveness and inattention, assume the same rapt mask.
Thank you for sharing that. This one stuck out to me particularly. It's so interesting to see how certain aspects of society change over time and how they don't. And especially within specific cultural groups. I was raised Mormon, so I really resonated with a lot of the things that you bring up as far as those expectations. Because a lot of those, whether spoken or just learned from example, were a lot of those same lessons that I was taught growing up that I carried into my adult life and my marriage, and that really caused a lot of problems over time.
They're hard, right? Mm-hmm. They're hard to shape.
Yeah, it's taken a long time to reevaluate and realize, that those were things that were taught to me. Those are not inescapable truths of life that I need to follow and adhere. And it's like, even now, I turned 40 this year, and there's still things that, I don't need to do that or see things that way. Like I can set my own expectations. Yeah, it's not an easy frame of mind to shift.
No, it's not. And I think when you're a writer, it's so important in order, well, particularly a poet who writes, I usually write in the first person, and so it's my point of view. It's what I've perceived or what I've been thinking about, or, an image that I thought of that goes onto the page. And there has to be a sense of self, in order to do that. A self not dependent on, I think in this poem I was particularly thinking of dinner parties where, it's just so easy to spend a whole evening for a woman asking about a man, what a man does, and never being really presenting oneself. I mean, even coming on this radio, to come and talk about my poetry on the radio, it's the opposite of how I was taught. I should be asking the questions and drawing somebody out, as opposed to being able to present myself and my work in a, interesting light. So.
It's something that takes a focused effort to relearn some of those lessons and to shake off, what we experience as young people embeds itself very deeply. And it's something that I think we see in a lot of areas of life today, whether it's, religious beliefs, political ideations, how a person should live, the type of existence. Those are very deeply rooted in a lot of people. And for some, like, almost impossible to change the mindset or the worldview, even as adults who've experienced the world. Yeah, in so many ways, I think that shapes people, and it can be really challenging to see another way to live.
how about if I I was going to read a slightly longer poem, if that's all right. I
Yeah.
think it's easy to follow. Arthritis, does that?
Oh, I absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say, I definitely wanted to get to that one.
Well, the first poem references, my thinking about what I was taught as a girl, and this poem, it starts with a conversation, so it does take place, I'd say, within my adulthood, within the last few years, before my mother's illness really kicked in. But anyway, it's called Arthritis. Save your hands, my mother says, seeing me untwist a jar's tight cap, just the way she used to tell me, not to let boys fool around or feel my breasts, keep them fresh for marriage, as if they were actual fruit. I scoffed to think they could bruise, scuff, soften, rot, wither. I look down now at my knuckly thumbs, my index finger permanently askew in the same classic crook as hers, called a swan's neck, as if snapped, it's that pronounced. Even as I type, wondering how long I'll be able to, each joint in my left hand needing to be hoisted, prodded into place, one knuckle like a clock style, clicking as it's turned to open, bend or unbend. I balk at the idea that we can overuse ourselves, must parcel out and pace our energies so as not to run out of any necessary component while still alive. The definition of necessarily suffering change over time. The only certainty is uncertainty, I thought I knew, so ignored whatever she said about boys and sex, her version of a story, never mine. It made me laugh, the way she made up traditions that we didn't kiss boys until a certain age. We didn't fool around. What we? What part of me was she? No part I could put my finger on. How odd then, one day to find her half napping in her room, talking first to herself and then to me about a boy she used to know, her friend's brother, who she kissed, she said, just because he wanted her to. Now why would I do that, she mused, distraught anew, and so freshly stung by the self-betrayal. I reached across the gulf my father left to her side of their bed and stroked my future hand.
Thank you for sharing that one. I think that's a great one to follow up with lessons. It was another one that stuck out to me as well, just thinking about that shift in perspective that we gain over time. And this one, especially with the physical aspect of it, was another thing I related to just because I was certain. I used to be a dental hygienist, so like one of my hands is all messed up, and I had surgery on my ankle recently because that got messed up from overuse and falling. So it was interesting to read that and think about how much some of that has changed over time on different levels. Yes, on the physical, we definitely become more aware of our bodies and its limitations and what we can do to mitigate some of the damage that our younger years may have caused. But how much of that, happens in other areas of our lives as well.
I mean, this is an example of a poem I wanted to write about, for some reason, about arthritis. And my arthritis isn't quite as bad now as it was when I wrote that poem. Okay. So, but in any case, an example of when I started writing about it, I had no idea that I would end up having in the poem things my mother had told me about boys, or that at the very end, my father would come up, who died many years before this poem takes place, or probably a few years before this poem takes place. So just the process of writing it and, and thinking about, well, what do I share with my mother? How are we different? What did I think we didn't share that we actually do share? And it just brought up much more than I would have thought when I started out. And I love that. I love the way the process leads one. The poem kind of shows it.
Yeah. And you never quite know where it's going to take you. I think in in many forms of art, that's true. You maybe start with one idea or thought or goal, and the process of actually developing that and going through it, it's never quite what you expected it to be, which I think is a wonderful part of creating anything. It never is, the exact picture of what maybe you imagined or what's in the cookbook or whatever it is that you had in your mind, because it's a process. It's an exploration of something, and that's going to be different every time you attempt it, and different between people as well.
Yeah.
I think we may have time for one, possibly two more.
Okay. Do you have anything you'd like me to read that you want to be sure I read?
I really enjoyed a Shoebox, if you want to do that one.
Read that. Shoebox. Busy little monkey mind at work while I watch the dance of willow leaves outside our window and remember other bedrooms, the way I recall past lives' vague but plausible camouflage. One year, beneath a crackle-printed comforter, I fret about the future. Another day, fanned out on a terry-cloth chaise, I pine for the past, for the bristle-haired troll dolls I kept in a shoebox when I was 10, and the lined index cards on which I wrote unconnected nouns over and over, each a skeleton key, keyed only to itself, unself-conscious as a series of selfies.
I love that last line.
Well, I have to say that, one thing I do enjoy a touch of humor in my writing, and I don't always know if it comes through, but I think that last line, it has that sort of irony, or how unself-conscious are selfies, really. But,
yeah, it's an interesting comparison, because even though, if you think about someone in a private space with nobody else around taking selfies of themselves, you're still kind of putting on a show, even just for yourself. And it's an interesting, I think, moment. I have a friend who talked about how selfies are kind of a form of mirror work, of looking at yourself more deeply and kind of seeing the subtle differences you express, based on emotions or what your thoughts or feelings are in that moment, which was an interesting conversation we had about that, because it wasn't something I had thought about before with selfies. I think they kind of get a negative connotation of like caring too much about what you look like, or focusing too much on yourself at time. Yeah, that's showing off. So it was interesting to see that contrast, and I kind of thought of that at the end of this poem, that conversation I'd had with Amy, because you think of everything else that's described in the poem, of these moments where you can just enjoy the thing that you enjoy. The bristle-haired troll dolls I loved. It made me think of when I was little, the collection of My Little Ponies I had. There was like way too many of them. We would pick them up at garage sales like all the time, me and my little sister, and I don't even know how many we had. But now it's kind of like, what a what a goofy thing now to like, think back to being like so obsessed with My Little Ponies. But at the time, like, we loved them. We had a great time playing with our My Little Ponies and doing their hair and brushing them, all of those things. Where it's like, you have those times in the moment, like you can just enjoy something that you love, and it's harder to find those moments as an adult at times.
Well, yes, I think there's another level to the poem too, where I realized that people sometimes say to me, "Oh, your poetry is very personal," and I want to say, well, my poetry operates on a personal level, and and then I'm always thrilled when somebody, like as you're saying, you find things in it and relate to it. It resounds to you on a personal level as well. And so in some ways, the poem doesn't make this explicit, but is writing like a series of selfies. It's kind of undercutting itself a little bit and playing with the idea of writing poetry.
I love that. That's a great way to look at it. Thank you. We have, I think, time for one more. Was there one last one that you would like to share?
Well, I'd like to read Meditation in the Open Air Garage.
Okay.
I'm very fortunate. We live in Santa Fe, and as northern New Mexico is a high desert, and so we have these incredible and old trees on where we live, and so that enters into this poem.
Okay.
Meditation in the Open Air Garage. Leaves have no choice but to articulate the wind. Aspens like zills, a glint and a tilt. The willow, a lone zither. Riffling the cottonwoods at dusk, winds find me cushioned against the concrete in the open air garage, facing the trees, the drive, the road, the mountains up the canyon's other side, until an onrush bellows, a mindless, heartless ecstasy through the empty sack of me.
Thank you for sharing that. It's a wonderful moment to have captured to end, and I believe that's the last one in the collection, right?
It is. Thank you. The sound, I've always loved the sound of wind in leaves, and meditating. This was the closest I could come to articulating myself as a leaf in the wind. And
I like that. I think that's something that is a very soothing sound for one. I like to listen to soundscapes like that when I'm having trouble sleeping and things like that. The wind. I have one that I like that's a campfire. It's just the sound of a campfire crackling that I really like. But just I think we get so busy in day-to-day life and we have so much on our mind that taking those moments to just sit, to listen, to be part of what's happening in that moment. Hard to remind ourselves to stop and do at times, but I think an important practice.
And that's wonderful things about reading poetry as well as writing it. It forces you to slow down. It forces you to stop and be in the moment and really, pay attention syllable by syllable or second by second, however you prefer, to the moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's such a different practice reading poetry over, novels or even short stories, longer forms like that. It really pushes you to pay attention and to understand that every word was chosen very specifically. Well, we are at the point to start wrapping up. So I did want to remind our readers that the collection is called Go Figure by Carol Moldaw. And Carol, where can people find you and your work online?
I do have a website, which is www.carolmoldaw, CarolMoldaw.com. The book's being published by Four Way Books in New York, and I know its publication date is September 15th, but I know if you go to Four Way's website, the book has a page and it's available for pre-order, probably available on as well. But on my website, there are individual poems there are links to individual poems that have, been published online.
Well, thank you so much, Carol, for taking the time to chat with me today. I really enjoyed getting the chance to read your poetry and then to be able to discuss it with you and share it with our listeners.
Thank you so much, DelSheree. I've enjoyed this as well.